The frozen breath of his gelding rose like spectral warnings in the December air, as Preston Bowman pushed through the barn doors expecting nothing more than another bitter Montana night. But what he found sprawled unconscious in the hay would change everything he thought he knew about keeping his heart locked away. She lay there like a broken angel, her lips blue and her skin pale as morning frost, wearing nothing but a thin cotton dress torn at the sleeves and hem. Preston dropped to his knees beside her, pressing 2 fingers against her throat. The pulse fluttered weakly beneath his calloused fingertips. She was alive, but barely. "Good Lord," he muttered, already shrugging out of his heavy sheepskin coat to wrap around her trembling form. She was light as thistledown when he lifted her, her head lolling against his chest as he carried her toward the house. The year was 1884, and Montana winters showed no mercy to anyone foolish enough to face them unprepared. Inside his modest ranch house, Preston laid her on the sofa near the fireplace and quickly stoked the flames higher. He pulled every blanket he owned from the bedroom, piling them over her still form. Her breathing remained shallow, her face deathly pale except for the frostbite darkening her fingertips and the tips of her ears. He knew about hypothermia. Living alone on a ranch 10 miles outside Kelton, Montana meant knowing how to handle emergencies without help. Preston heated water on the stove, filled several bottles, and tucked them carefully around her body beneath the blankets. Then he did the only other thing he could think of. He sat beside her and waited, occasionally checking her pulse, praying to a God he had not spoken to in years. Hours passed. The grandfather clock in the corner marked midnight, then 1, then 2. Finally, as dawn began to paint the windows with pale light, she stirred. Her eyelids fluttered and Preston leaned forward. "Easy now," he said softly. "You are safe." Her eyes opened, revealing irises the color of spring leaves, confused and frightened. She tried to speak, but only managed a hoarse whisper. "Do not try to talk yet," Preston told her, reaching for the cup of warm broth he had kept ready. "Just small sips." He helped her raise her head, supporting her with one arm while holding the cup to her lips with his other hand. She drank gratefully, though her hands shook when she tried to hold the cup herself. "Where am I?" she finally managed, her voice raspy and weak. "My ranch about 10 miles west of Kelton. I am Preston Bowman. I found you in my barn last night, nearly frozen to death. What is your name?" "Julia," she whispered. "Julia Carson." "Well, Miss Carson, you are lucky to be alive. Another hour out there and you would not have been." He studied her face, noting the delicate features now slowly regaining some color. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, he guessed. He was 30 himself, old enough to have learned caution around beautiful women, especially mysterious ones who appeared half dead in his barn. "What were you doing out there in this weather dressed like that?" Fear flashed across her face, and she tried to sit up too quickly. Preston gently pressed her back down. "Easy, you are still recovering." "I have to go," she said, panic rising in her voice. "He will find me. He will kill me this time." Preston felt his jaw tighten. "Who will find you?" Tears spilled down her cheeks. "My husband, former husband." "I thought he was anyway. The marriage was not legal. I found out 2 weeks ago he already had a wife back in Ohio. When I confronted him, he beat me worse than ever before. I ran. I have been running for days." The story spilled out of her in broken fragments. She had come to Montana 6 months earlier as a mail-order bride, believing she was marrying a successful rancher named Marcus Whitley. The reality had been far different. Whitley was a drunk and a brute who had lured her west with lies. When she discovered the truth about his existing wife and tried to leave, he had beaten her and locked her in their cabin. She had escaped 3 nights ago during a supply run to town, stealing a horse and riding blind into the darkness. "The horse threw me yesterday," she continued, her voice breaking. "I walked until I could not walk anymore. I saw your barn and thought I could rest for just a moment, but I must have passed out." Preston listened to all of this with growing anger. He had seen men like Marcus Whitley before, cowards who preyed on those weaker than themselves. "You are safe here," he said firmly. "I will not let anyone hurt you." "You do not understand," Julia said, fresh tears streaming down her face. "Marcus has friends, bad men. They will come looking for me." "Let them come," Preston said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "This is my land and I protect what is mine." The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than he had intended. Julia studied his face, this stranger who had saved her life, and something shifted in her expression. Hope, perhaps, or the first tentative threads of trust. Over the next 2 days, Preston cared for Julia with a tenderness that surprised them both. He made her simple meals of soup and bread, changed the dressings on her frostbitten fingers, and kept the fire burning high. He gave her his bedroom and slept on the sofa, insisting she needed the better rest. They talked in the evenings, sharing stories of their lives. Preston told her about his parents, who had died of fever when he was 19, leaving him the ranch. He spoke of the years of hard work building up the herd, the loneliness of the life he had chosen, and the quiet satisfaction of owning something that was truly his. Julia listened, seeing in his weathered face and gentle hands a goodness she had thought did not exist in men. She told him about growing up in Boston, the daughter of a schoolteacher who died when she was 16. Her mother had passed years before that, leaving Julia alone with few prospects. When her father died, she had found herself penniless and desperate. The advertisement for a mail-order bride had seemed like providence, a chance at a new life far from the painful memories of Boston. "I was so foolish," she said on the second evening, sitting wrapped in blankets by the fire while Preston mended a bridle. "I should have known it was too good to be true." "You were not foolish," Preston said, not looking up from his work. "You were brave. It takes courage to leave everything you know and travel halfway across the country for a chance at something better. And look where it got me." "It got you here," Preston said simply, finally meeting her eyes. "And I am grateful for that." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something neither of them was quite ready to name. Julia felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with her recent ordeal. Preston cleared his throat and returned his attention to the bridle, but his hands were not quite steady. On the third day, Julia felt strong enough to walk around the house without assistance. Preston had gone out to tend to his horses and cattle, and she took the opportunity to explore. The house was simple but well kept, everything in its place. She found herself studying the small details that revealed who Preston Bowman truly was. The books on a shelf by his bed, classics and agricultural journals, the carefully mended curtains, the photographs of a stern-faced couple she assumed were his parents. She was standing by the window watching him work with one of his horses when a flash of movement in the distance caught her eye. 3 riders were approaching from the east, moving fast. Her blood turned to ice. "Preston!" she screamed, running for the door. He heard the panic in her voice and came running, reaching the porch just as she stumbled outside. "What is it, riders? 3 of them. It is Marcus. I know it is." Preston squinted against the winter sun, making out the approaching figures. His expression hardened. "Get inside. Lock the door. Do not come out no matter what you hear. Preston, please, they will hurt you." He looked down at her, and for a moment his hand came up to gently touch her cheek. "Trust me, I will not let them take you." Then he was striding toward the barn, emerging moments later with a rifle in his hands. Julia watched from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs as the three riders drew closer. They pulled up 20 yards from the house, their horses stamping and blowing in the cold air. The man in the middle was tall and heavy-set with a red face and mean eyes. Julia recognized Marcus Whitley instantly, and her stomach churned with fear. "I am looking for my wife," Marcus called out, not bothering with pleasantries. "I got word she might have ended up here." "Your wife," Preston said calmly. "I heard you already got a wife back in Ohio." "Which makes this woman you are chasing just another one of your victims." Marcus's face darkened. "That is none of your business. The girl belongs to me. Send her out and we will be on our way." "She does not belong to anyone," Preston said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge now. "And she is not going anywhere with you." One of the other men, a lean fellow with a scar across his jaw, leaned forward in his saddle. "We can do this easy or hard, friend. There are 3 of us and 1 of you." "I only see 3 targets," Preston replied, "and I do not miss." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Marcus made the mistake Preston had been anticipating. His hand moved toward his gun. Preston's rifle was up and firing in one smooth motion. The bullet kicked up dirt inches from Marcus's horse's hooves, making the animal rear. Marcus fought to control his mount, his face purple with rage. "Next one goes through your leg," Preston said, already levering another round into the chamber. "The one after that through your head. You have 3 seconds to turn around and ride out of here. 1. "You are making a big mistake," the scarred man growled. 2. Marcus yanked his horse around. "This is not over. 3. They rode off, Marcus shouting curses over his shoulder. Preston stood watching until they disappeared over the ridge, then finally lowered his rifle. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear but from the adrenaline. He had not killed anyone, but he had been prepared to. The realization of what he had been willing to do for this woman he barely knew left him momentarily stunned. Julia met him at the door, throwing her arms around him before he could say anything. She was crying and laughing at the same time, her face buried against his chest. "Thank you," she kept saying. "Thank you, thank you." Preston wrapped his arms around her, feeling the rightness of it, the way she fit against him as though she had always belonged there. "I meant what I said. I will not let anyone hurt you." She pulled back to look up at him, her eyes searching his face. Why would you risk your life for me? You do not even know me." "I know enough," he said softly. "I know you are brave and strong and deserve better than what life has given you so far. I know that finding you in my barn was the best thing that has happened to me in 10 years. And I know that if you give me a chance, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to be afraid again." The words surprised them both. Preston had not planned to say any of it, but once started, he could not stop. 3 days. He had known this woman for 3 days, and yet he was more certain of his feelings for her than he had been of anything in his entire life. Julia reached up, touching his face with trembling fingers. "I never believed in love at first sight. I thought it was something people made up for stories. But when I woke up and saw you there, taking care of me even though I was a stranger, I felt something I never felt before. Safe. Valued. Like I mattered to someone." "You matter to me," Preston said, covering her hand with his own. "You matter more than I can explain." "I am falling in love with you," Julia whispered. "Is that insane? Is it just because you saved me?" "If it is insane, then we are both crazy," Preston said, and then he was kissing her, gently at first, then with growing passion as she responded, her arms tightening around his neck. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. "Marry me," Preston said. Julia laughed, the sound pure and joyful. "We have known each other for 3 days. I do not need 3 years to know what I want. I want you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. I want to build a life with you, right here on this ranch. I want children with your eyes and your courage. I want everything, Julia, but only if you want it too." She was crying again, but these were tears of joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you. I want all of those things too." Preston pulled her close again, resting his chin on top of her head, hardly able to believe this was real. "I will ride into Kelton tomorrow and talk to the Reverend. We can be married as soon as possible." "Preston," Julia said, her voice muffled against his chest. "What if Marcus comes back? Then I will deal with him. But I do not think he will. Cowards like him only pick fights they know they can win. He saw today that taking you will cost him, and men like Marcus Whitley are not willing to pay that price." He was right. Marcus did not return that day or the next. Preston rode into Kelton the following morning, leaving Julia with strict instructions to stay inside with his spare rifle within reach. He need not have worried. The town of Kelton was small, barely 300 souls, but news traveled fast. The story of Preston's confrontation with Marcus Whitley had already made the rounds, growing more dramatic with each retelling. Reverend Thomas Murphy greeted Preston warmly in the church, a simple white building at the edge of town. "I heard you had some excitement out at your place," the Reverend said, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Is it true about the girl?" Preston told him the whole story, holding nothing back. Reverend Murphy listened gravely, his expression darkening when Preston described Marcus's treatment of Julia. "There is evil in this world," the Reverend said when Preston finished. "But there is goodness too. You showed that goodness, son. Taking in a stranger, protecting her, offering her a home. That is the kind of thing the Lord calls us to do." "I want to marry her," Preston said. "I know it seems sudden, but I have never been more certain of anything." The Reverend studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I have known you since you were a boy, Preston. You are steady and true. If you say you love this woman, then I believe you. But are you certain she loves you back? Or might she simply be grateful for being saved?" It was the same question Preston had asked himself 100 times in the past day. "I have thought about that," he admitted. "But when I look at her, when I talk to her, it is not gratitude I see in her eyes. It is something more, something real." "Then I will marry you," Reverend Murphy said. "But not tomorrow. Give it a week. Let people see that this is not just a reaction to danger but a genuine commitment. Let Julia have time to be certain of her own heart without the immediate threat of Marcus Whitley hanging over her." Preston wanted to argue, wanted to insist that waiting was unnecessary, but he saw the wisdom in the Reverend's words. "1 week," he agreed. He stopped by the general store on his way out of town to pick up supplies. Mrs. Henderson, the shopkeeper's wife, gave him a knowing smile as she packaged up flour and sugar. "I heard you are getting married," she said. Preston should have been surprised by how fast word had spread, but he was not. "In a week, if all goes well." "She is a lucky woman, that Julia Carson. You are a good man, Preston Bowman." "I think I am the lucky one," Preston said quietly. On his ride back to the ranch, Preston spotted fresh tracks in the snow. 3 horses, riding hard toward the north. Marcus and his friends heading away from Kelton. Relief washed through him. They were leaving just as he had hoped. Julia was waiting at the window when he returned, her face lighting up at the sight of him. She helped him carry in the supplies, chattering happily about how she had spent the day cleaning the house and planning where she might plant a garden come spring. "You are already planning to stay?" Preston teased gently. "If you will have me," she said, suddenly shy. He set down the bag of flour and pulled her into his arms. "Always. The Reverend wants us to wait a week before the wedding. He thinks we should be certain." "Are you certain?" Julia asked, looking up at him. "More certain than I have ever been about anything." "Are you?" She answered him with a kiss that left no room for doubt. When they finally broke apart, she said, "I have been thinking about what you said about me only feeling grateful. I want you to know that is not what this is. I have been grateful to people before. I was grateful to my father, to my neighbors in Boston who helped me after he died. This feeling I have for you is nothing like gratitude. It is bigger and brighter and terrifying and wonderful all at once. It is love, Preston. Real love." The week that followed was the happiest of Preston's life. He and Julia fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side during the day and talking long into the night. She proved to be a quick learner, mastering the wood stove and even helping him with some of the lighter ranch work. He taught her to shoot, standing behind her with his arms around hers, showing her how to sight down the barrel of the rifle. "I never thought I would need to know this in Boston," she said, hitting the target he had set up against the barn wall. "Boston never threw Marcus Whitley at you," Preston replied. She grew serious. "Do you think he is really gone? I saw their tracks heading north. I think he decided you were not worth the trouble. Men like him always do." He turned her gently to face him. "But even if he comes back, even if it is 10 years from now, the answer will be the same. You are mine to protect now, and I take that seriously." "Yours," Julia repeated softly, testing the word. Then she smiled. "I like the sound of that." They rode into Kelton together the day before the wedding so Julia could meet some of the townspeople and buy fabric for a new dress. The women of Kelton welcomed her with a warmth that brought tears to her eyes. Mrs. Henderson insisted on helping her pick out material, settling on a soft blue wool that matched her eyes. "You will be a beautiful bride," Mrs. Henderson said, squeezing Julia's hand. "And you will have a good life with Preston. He is one of the finest men I know." That night, back at the ranch, Julia worked on her dress while Preston carved a small wooden box at the kitchen table. She asked him what he was making, but he just smiled and said it was a surprise. "I wish I had something to give you," she said wistfully. "A wife should bring something to a marriage besides just herself." Preston looked up from his work. "You are bringing yourself. That is everything I want, everything I need. But I have no money, no possessions except the clothes you have bought me. I feel like I am taking advantage of your kindness." He set down his knife and came to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Listen to me carefully, Julia Carson. You are not taking advantage of anything. You are giving me a gift I never thought I would have. A partner, a companion, someone to share my life with. This ranch was just a place before you came. Now it is starting to feel like a home. That is because of you. I will work hard," she promised. "I will learn everything I need to know to be a good rancher's wife. I know you will, but that is not why I am marrying you. I am marrying you because I love you, because you make me laugh and make me think and make me want to be better than I am. The rest is just details." The wedding took place on a clear, cold Sunday morning in December. The church was full despite the weather, the entire town turning out to witness the union. Julia wore her blue dress with her hair pinned up, a few loose curls framing her face. Preston had never seen anything more beautiful. Reverend Murphy performed the ceremony with warmth and dignity, speaking about love and commitment and the sanctity of marriage. When Preston slipped the simple gold band onto Julia's finger, his hands were steady, his voice strong and clear as he made his vows. Julia's voice trembled slightly with emotion, but her eyes never left his face as she promised to love and cherish him all the days of her life. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Murphy said with a broad smile. "Preston, you may kiss your bride." And he did, thoroughly and tenderly, while the congregation erupted in applause and cheers. When they finally pulled apart, both were laughing, giddy with joy and relief and the sheer rightness of it all. The town had organized a small reception in the church hall, with food and music and dancing. Preston had not danced since he was a boy, but he held Julia in his arms and swayed to the fiddle music, not caring that he was clumsy or that people were watching. All that mattered was the woman in his arms and the gold ring on her finger that marked her as his wife, Mrs. Henderson cornered them during a break in the music, pressing a package into Julia's hands. "Just a little something to help you set up your home," she said. Inside were carefully wrapped dishes, a set of 6 in a delicate floral pattern. Julia hugged the older woman, too moved to speak. "You take care of each other," Mrs. Henderson said, her own eyes suspiciously bright. "That is all that matters in the end." They left the reception as the sun was setting, riding back to the ranch together on Preston's horse with Julia sitting in front of him, her back against his chest. It had started to snow, soft white flakes drifting down from a gray sky. "Are you warm enough?" Preston asked, tightening his arm around her waist. "I am perfect," Julia said, and meant it. A week ago she had been running for her life, freezing and terrified. Now she was a married woman, riding home with a man who loved her, who had proven he would protect her no matter the cost. It seemed impossible that so much could change in such a short time. At the house, Preston insisted on carrying her over the threshold, making her laugh with his mock-serious expression. "It is tradition," he said solemnly. "I am not about to start our marriage by ignoring tradition." "You are ridiculous," she said, but she was smiling as she said it. He set her down gently in the living room, then went to stoke the fire. Julia watched him move around the space that was now as much hers as his, still hardly able to believe this was her life now. When he finished with the fire, he retrieved the small wooden box he had been working on and handed it to her. "I wanted to give you something," he said. "I know it is not much, but I made it for you." Julia opened the box carefully. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, was a silver locket on a delicate chain. Her breath caught. "Preston, this is beautiful. Where did you get this?" "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "The only piece of jewelry she owned. She wore it every day until she died. I want you to have it." Tears streamed down Julia's face as she lifted the locket from the box. She opened it and found a lock of dark hair on one side. "Is this hers?" "Yes, and I thought maybe someday we could put a picture of our family on the other side when we have children." Julia set the box aside and threw her arms around his neck. "I love you so much," she whispered fiercely. "I will treasure this always." Preston fastened the locket around her neck, his fingers lingering on her skin. "I love you too, more than I ever thought possible." That night, as they lay together in the darkness of the bedroom, Preston held Julia close and marveled at the turn his life had taken. A week ago he had been a lonely rancher with no prospects beyond his cattle and his land. Now he had a wife, a beautiful, brave woman who had chosen to build a life with him. It felt like a dream, but the warmth of her body against his and the sound of her breathing assured him it was wonderfully, impossibly real. Winter deepened, and with it, the bond between Preston and Julia grew stronger. She learned the rhythms of ranch life quickly, proving to be far more resilient than her delicate appearance suggested. She could cook over the temperamental wood stove, churn butter, mend clothes and tack, and even help Preston with the horses when needed. She attacked each new task with determination, refusing to be defeated by her own inexperience. Preston, for his part, found himself softening in ways he had not expected. He had lived alone for so long, growing hard and self-sufficient. But Julia's presence in his life reminded him of the value of gentleness, of taking time to appreciate small joys. She would drag him away from his work to watch the sunset, or insist they spend an evening reading aloud to each other by the fire. These moments, which he once would have dismissed as frivolous, became the highlights of his days. January gave way to February, and still there was no sign of Marcus Whitley. Preston remained vigilant, never venturing far from the ranch without his rifle, always keeping an eye on the horizon for approaching riders. But as the weeks passed with no trouble, he began to relax slightly. Perhaps Marcus really had given up and moved on. One evening in late February, as they were finishing dinner, Julia set down her fork and looked at Preston with an expression he could not quite read. "I have something to tell you," she said. Preston felt his heart skip. "What is it?" "Are you all right?" "I am more than all right." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I am with child." For a moment Preston could not speak, then a grin spread across his face so wide it almost hurt. "Truly, truly, I am certain now. By my calculations, the baby will come in late September or early October." Preston came around the table and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around while she laughed. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, as though repetition would make it more real. "We are going to have a baby." "You are happy?" Julia asked, though she could see the answer on his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it. You have given me everything I never knew I wanted, Julia. A home, a family, a future worth building toward." That night, they lay awake planning, talking about names and whether they should add a room onto the house, and how they would manage the ranch work, once Julia grew too heavy with child to help as much. It was all speculation and daydreaming, but Preston loved every moment of it, loved seeing Julia's eyes light up as she talked about their child. Spring came late that year, the snow finally melting in mid-March to reveal the brown grass underneath. Preston spent long days repairing fences and preparing for calving season, while Julia worked on transforming one corner of the bedroom into a nursery. She sewed tiny clothes from scraps of fabric Mrs. Henderson donated, her needle flying as her belly slowly began to swell with new life. They were happy in a way that felt almost dangerous, as though acknowledging their joy might somehow jinx it. But the weeks continued to pass peacefully. The cattle thrived, the ranch prospered, and Julia grew rounder and more radiant with each passing day. In May, Preston came in from the fields to find Julia standing in the doorway, one hand pressed to her belly and a look of wonder on her face. "What is it?" he asked, immediately concerned. "The baby," she said. "I felt it move. Here, give me your hand." She placed his palm against her stomach, and after a moment he felt it too, a tiny flutter like butterfly wings against his skin. Their baby. Their child. The reality of it hit him with overwhelming force, and he found himself blinking back tears. "That is our son or daughter," Julia said softly, covering his hand with hers. "Can you believe it?" "I am starting to," Preston said hoarsely. June brought warmer weather and longer days. Preston hired a young man named Daniel to help with the increased workload, wanting to make sure Julia was not overtaxed. She protested at first, insisting she was perfectly capable, but Preston was firm. "I am not taking any chances with you or the baby," he said. "Besides, it gives me peace of mind knowing someone else is here when I have to go into town or check the far pastures." Daniel proved to be a hard worker and a pleasant companion. He was 19, quiet and respectful, grateful for the steady work, and the small cabin Preston let him use on the edge of the property. Julia liked him immediately, and Preston found himself enjoying having another person around, someone to share the load and provide an extra set of hands. It was Daniel who spotted the riders approaching one hot afternoon in July. Preston and Julia were in the garden, Julia supervising while Preston did the actual digging, when Daniel came running from the barn. "Riders coming," he called. "Looks like 5 or 6 of them." Preston's good mood evaporated instantly. He helped Julia to her feet, and told her to go inside while he and Daniel went to meet whoever was coming. His rifle was in his hands before the riders came into clear view, but it was not Marcus Whitley and his thugs. It was Sheriff Bill Taylor from Kelton, along with several other men Preston recognized from town. They pulled up in the yard, and the sheriff tipped his hat. "Preston, Mrs. Bowman," he said, nodding to Julia, who had ignored Preston's instruction and was standing on the porch. "Sorry to disturb you, but I thought you should hear this from me. Marcus Whitley is dead," Julia gasped, one hand flying to her mouth. Preston felt a rush of relief so intense it made him dizzy. "What happened?" "Got himself killed in a bar fight up in Helena 3 nights ago. Pulled a gun on the wrong man and got shot for his trouble. We just got word this morning." The sheriff's eyes moved to Julia. "I figured you would want to know, madam. That whole business about him claiming you as his wife, that is over now. No one is going to come looking for you." "Thank you, Sheriff," Julia managed, her voice unsteady. After the sheriff and his men left, Preston held Julia while she cried. They were not tears of sadness but of relief, of finally being able to let go of the fear that had been a constant companion these past months. "It is really over," she said against his chest. "He cannot hurt me anymore. He cannot hurt our baby." "No," Preston agreed. "He cannot. You are safe now, Julia, truly safe." That night they celebrated quietly, just the two of them, holding each other close and talking late into the night about the future that was now truly theirs to build. The shadow that had hung over their happiness was finally gone. August came, and Julia grew large and uncomfortable in the heat. Preston fussed over her constantly, bringing her cool drinks and insisting she rest in the shade. She tolerated his hovering with good-natured patience, knowing it came from a place of love. "I am not made of glass," she reminded him one particularly hot afternoon when he insisted on carrying a basket that could not have weighed more than a few pounds. "I know that, but humor me. In a few months, you will have a screaming baby to deal with, and you will miss the days when your biggest problem was your overprotective husband." She laughed and kissed his cheek. "I will never miss the days before you. Never." September arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color in the trees. Julia's due date was approaching, and Preston found himself increasingly anxious. He rode into Kelton and asked Mrs. Henderson to come stay at the ranch as the time grew near. The older woman agreed readily, arriving with her medical kit and a calm competence that put them both at ease. "I have delivered more babies than I can count," she assured Preston when he nervously asked if they should try to get a doctor from the nearest large town. "Your Julia is young and healthy. She will do just fine." Mrs. Henderson was right. Julia went into labor on a crisp morning in late September, and after a long but uncomplicated labor, she delivered a healthy baby boy just before dawn the next day. Preston, who had paced the living room all night while Mrs. Henderson attended to Julia in the bedroom, was finally allowed in to meet his son. Julia looked exhausted but radiant, propped up against pillows with a tiny bundle in her arms. When Preston approached, she pulled back the blanket to reveal a red-faced infant with a shock of dark hair. "Meet your son," she said softly. Preston reached out with trembling hands to touch the baby's impossibly small fingers. His son, his child. The wonder of it left him speechless. "What should we name him?" Julia asked. They had discussed names endlessly over the past months but had never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his son's face, Preston knew exactly what the baby's name should be. "Thomas," he said. "After Reverend Murphy, the man who married us and believed in us from the start." Julia smiled. "Thomas Bowman, I like that. Thomas Preston Bowman." "Thomas Preston Bowman," Preston repeated, testing the name. Then he leaned down and kissed his wife's forehead. "Thank you for giving me this." for giving me everything." "We gave this to each other," Julia corrected gently. "Everything we have, we built together." Mrs. Henderson stayed for a week, teaching Julia the basics of caring for a newborn and making sure mother and baby were both healthy and thriving. When she finally returned to Kelton, she left behind a household transformed by the presence of the tiny new life. Thomas was a good baby, fussy only when hungry or needing to be changed. Preston took to fatherhood with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. He would walk the floor with Thomas in the middle of the night, singing off key lullabies and telling the baby stories about the ranch and the horses and all the things they would do together when Thomas was older. Julia would watch from the bed, her heart so full she thought it might burst. This man, this good, strong, gentle man who had taken her in when she had nothing, who had protected her and loved her and given her a home and a family. She had been so lost, so broken, and he had made her whole again. Winter came again, the second winter of their marriage. Thomas was 3 months old now, growing strong and starting to smile and coo. They celebrated Christmas quietly, just the three of them, with Daniel joining them for dinner. Preston had carved a small wooden horse for Thomas, even though the baby was far too young to play with it yet. "He will have it when he is ready," Preston said when Julia pointed this out. "I want him to have something I made for him." On New Year's Eve, after Thomas was asleep in his cradle and the house was quiet, Preston and Julia sat together by the fire, reflecting on the year that had passed. "A year ago, I did not know you existed," Preston said, his arm around Julia's shoulders. "Now I cannot imagine my life without you." "A year ago I was running for my life, terrified and alone," Julia said. "Now I am sitting in a warm house with a husband who loves me and a beautiful son sleeping in the next room. It feels like a miracle." "It was not a miracle," Preston said. "It was you being brave enough to run, being strong enough to survive. Being willing to take a chance on a lonely rancher who found you in his barn." Julia turned to look at him, reaching up to touch his face. "You saved my life, not just by bringing me inside that night, but by giving me a reason to want to live again. I had given up, Preston. I thought there was nothing good left in the world. Then I woke up and saw you and everything changed." They kissed, long and sweet, tasting of contentment and promise. When they finally pulled apart, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "Here is to the new year," he said. "And all the years after that, all the years we will have together." The years did indeed stretch out before them, full and rich and good. Thomas grew from an infant into a toddler, then a boy, sturdy and adventurous like his father, with his mother's green eyes and quick smile. When he was 3, Julia gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine, a tiny girl with golden curls who had Preston wrapped around her finger from the moment she drew her first breath. The ranch prospered. Preston's herd grew, his reputation as a fair dealer and skilled rancher spreading throughout Montana. He took on more help, building a proper bunkhouse for the ranch hands and establishing himself as one of the more successful ranchers in the region. But success never changed him. He remained the same steady, gentle man Julia had fallen in love with that frozen December so many years ago. He was a devoted father, patient and loving with his children, teaching Thomas to ride and helping Catherine learn her letters. He was a faithful husband, never letting a day pass without telling Julia he loved her, without showing her in 100 small ways that she was cherished. Julia thrived as well. The frightened, desperate woman who had collapsed in Preston's barn was long gone, replaced by a confident, capable rancher's wife who could doctor a sick calf, balance the ranch's books, and host a dinner party for 20 with equal ease. She started a small school in Kelton, teaching the children of the town and nearby ranches, sharing the love of learning her father had instilled in her. On their 5th anniversary, Preston took Julia back to the barn where he had found her. It had been expanded and improved over the years, now housing a dozen horses instead of the original 4. But the corner where he had discovered her that frozen night remained largely unchanged. "I think about that night sometimes," he said, standing with Julia in his arms in the spot where she had lain half dead. "What would have happened if I had decided to check the barn in the morning instead of that night, if I had come just an hour later?" "But you did not," Julia said firmly. "You came when you did and you saved me. That is all that matters. Do you ever regret it, saying yes so quickly, marrying a man you had known for 3 days?" Julia turned in his arms to face him fully. "Not for one single second. You were right, Preston. You did not need 3 years to know what you wanted, and neither did I. I knew, the moment I woke up and saw you sitting beside me, that my life had just changed forever. I knew you were different, special. I knew I could trust you. Everything that came after just proved I was right." Preston pulled the small wooden box from his pocket, the one he had given her on their wedding day. "I have something for you." Julia opened it to find a new photograph inside the locket, replacing the lock of his mother's hair. It was a family portrait they had taken in Kelton just a week before. Preston and Julia seated with Thomas standing between them and baby Catherine on Julia's lap, all of them smiling at the camera. "Our family," Preston said. "Like I promised that first night. Now the locket is complete." Tears sparkled in Julia's eyes as she looked at the photograph. "It is perfect. We are perfect." They were not perfect, of course. Life was never perfect. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick animals and broken equipment, moments of frustration and worry and fear. Thomas broke his arm falling from a horse when he was 7. Catherine came down with a terrible fever when she was 4 that had them both sick with worry until it finally broke. There were disagreements and misunderstandings, times when they snapped at each other from exhaustion or stress. But through it all, the foundation of love and trust they had built in those first 3 days held firm. They weathered every storm together, always choosing each other, always remembering what they had overcome to build this life. When Thomas was 10 and Catherine was 7, Julia gave birth to twin boys, James and John, who brought chaos and joy to the household in equal measure. Preston, now 45, sometimes joked that he was getting too old to chase after 4 children, but everyone could see the pride and happiness in his eyes when he looked at his growing family. As the children grew, Preston made sure to tell them the story of how he and their mother met, wanting them to understand the power of courage and compassion and love. Thomas, who had inherited his father's quiet strength, listened thoughtfully. Catherine, who had her mother's quick mind and kind heart, always cried at the part where Preston sent Marcus away. The twins, wild and rambunctious, mostly just wanted to hear about the guns and the standoff. "The important thing," Preston would always conclude, "is that your mother and I took a chance on each other. We did not let fear or doubt stop us from reaching for happiness. And that chance gave us you 4, which makes us the luckiest parents in all of Montana." Julia would usually add her own coda to the story. "And the lesson is that when life gets hard, you keep going. You do not give up, because you never know what miracle might be waiting for you just around the corner." On their 10th anniversary, the whole town of Kelton threw them a party. It had become something of a legend, the story of the lonely rancher and the woman he found freezing in his barn, who became his wife 3 days later. People spoke of it as proof that true love existed, that good things could come from the darkest moments. Reverend Murphy, now elderly but still sharp as ever, offered a toast at the celebration. I was skeptical when Preston came to me wanting to marry a woman he barely knew, he admitted. I thought he was making a mistake, rushing into something he would regret. I have never been happier to be wrong. Preston and Julia have built something beautiful together. A strong marriage, a loving family, a life that is a testament to the power of faith and love. They are an example to all of us. The applause that followed brought tears to Julia's eyes. She looked around at the gathered crowd, at the friends they had made, the community they had become a part of, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. She had come to Montana alone and afraid, with nothing but the clothes on her back. Now she had everything that mattered. That night after the party, after the children were finally asleep and the house was quiet, Preston and Julia sat together on the porch, watching the stars. 10 years, Julia said softly. It feels like a lifetime and like no time at all. Best 10 years of my life, Preston said, pulling her close against his side. Mine too. She paused, then added, Do you remember what you said to me that third day? When Marcus came, I said a lot of things that day. You said I mattered to you, that I mattered more than you could explain. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. I want you to know that you matter to me too, more than words can say. You gave me back my life, Preston. You gave me back myself. Preston kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. We saved each other, he said quietly. That is what I think. You needed someone to keep you safe, and I needed someone to remind me why safety was worth fighting for. We each gave the other what was missing. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, holding each other, content simply to be together under the vast Montana sky. Inside, their children slept peacefully. Around them, the ranch Preston had built with his own hands thrived. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human joy and sorrow. But Preston and Julia were not thinking about the stars or the ranch or anything beyond the warmth of each other's presence. They were thinking about how a single moment, a single choice, can change everything. How Preston's decision to check the barn that frozen December night had set in motion a chain of events that led to this. A life full of love and purpose and belonging. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. Thomas grew into a fine young man, taking on more responsibility at the ranch and showing a natural talent for working with horses. At 18, he started courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a smart, pretty girl named Sarah who Julia approved of immediately. Catherine became a teacher like her mother, starting her own school in a growing town 30 miles away. She came home often, bringing stories of her students and her own adventures. The twins, now 15, were as wild as ever but showed signs of settling into the serious business of learning to run a ranch. Preston, now in his mid-50s, had silver in his hair and lines around his eyes, but he remained strong and vital. He still rose before dawn every day, still worked alongside his men, still made time to sit with Julia every evening and talk about their day. His love for her had not diminished with time. If anything, it had deepened, matured into something even stronger than the passionate certainty of those first 3 days. Julia, at 48, was still beautiful, though her beauty had changed from the fragile, desperate quality she had possessed when Preston first found her. She was strong now, confident, a woman who knew her worth and her place in the world. She wore the silver locket every day, and when people asked about it, she would tell them it was her most treasured possession, a gift from her husband on their wedding day. On their 15th anniversary, Preston took Julia back to Kelton to renew their vows. It had been her idea, wanting to mark the occasion with something special. Reverend Murphy had passed away 2 years earlier, but his replacement, a young minister named David Green, was happy to perform the ceremony. The church was packed again, just as it had been 15 years ago. Their children sat in the front row, Thomas with Sarah at his side, Catherine home for the occasion, the twins fidgeting in their Sunday best. Friends and neighbors filled every other pew, all of them wanting to be part of the celebration. Preston and Julia stood before the altar, holding hands, looking into each other's eyes as they repeated the vows they had first made so many years ago. The words were the same, but they carried so much more weight now, backed by 15 years of keeping those promises through good times and bad. When Reverend Green pronounced them still husband and wife, Preston kissed Julia to thunderous applause and cheering. And just like 15 years ago, he did not care that people were watching. All that mattered was the woman in his arms and the life they had built together. The celebration that followed was bigger than their 10th anniversary party, with music and dancing and food enough to feed half the county. Preston danced with Julia, with Catherine, even with Sarah, who would officially become his daughter-in-law in a few months when she and Thomas married. He danced with Mrs. Henderson, now quite elderly but still sharp and spry, who reminded him that she had predicted he and Julia would have a good life together. "You were right," Preston told her, "about everything." As the evening wore on and the party began to wind down, Preston found himself standing at the edge of the festivities, watching his family. Thomas was laughing at something Sarah said, his face lit with the same kind of happiness Preston felt every time he looked at Julia. Catherine was dancing with one of the twins while the other tried to sneak another piece of cake. Julia was in the middle of a group of women, telling some story that had them all laughing. This, Preston thought, was what happiness looked like. Not the desperate, uncertain happiness of those first few days when he and Julia were still figuring out what they meant to each other. This was the deep, abiding happiness that came from years of choosing each other, of building something lasting and true. Julia caught his eye across the room and smiled, excusing herself from her conversation to come to his side. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, slipping her arm through his. "Everything," he said. "How we got here, how lucky I am." "How lucky we are," she corrected. "I am just as lucky as you, Preston Bowman, maybe more so." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Do you remember what I told you that first day, when I asked you to marry me? You told me a lot of things. Which part?" "I said I wanted to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. I said I wanted children with your eyes and your courage. I said I wanted everything." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I got it, Julia. You gave me everything I asked for and more than I even knew to want. Thank you for that. Thank you for saying yes." Julia reached up to touch his face, her eyes bright with tears. "Thank you for asking. Thank you for being brave enough to love me when I was too broken to believe I deserved to be loved. Thank you for being the man you are, every single day." They kissed, soft and sweet, surrounded by the noise and warmth of the celebration but aware of nothing beyond each other. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "Come on," Julia said, tugging his hand. "Let us go dance. Our children are watching, and I want them to see how it is done." Preston let her pull him back into the celebration, back into the warmth and light and noise. Back into the life they had built together, one day at a time, starting from that frozen December night 15 years ago. The ranch continued to thrive under Preston's careful stewardship. Thomas took over more of the day-to-day operations as Preston began to slow down slightly, though he never truly retired. He was always there, offering advice and guidance, working alongside his son and grandson, for Thomas and Sarah had given them a baby boy they named Preston Jr. Catherine married a school teacher from a nearby town and had 3 children of her own. daughters who visited the ranch often and adored their grandfather. The twins both stayed on at the ranch, each carving out their own roles, James managing the business side while John focused on expanding the herd. Preston and Julia became grandparents 7 times over, and each grandchild was precious to them, a continuation of the legacy they had built together. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the grandchildren play in the yard, and marvel at how far they had come from that desperate beginning. On their 25th anniversary, Preston surprised Julia with a trip to Boston. It was her first time back since leaving all those years ago, and the city had changed dramatically. But some things were the same. The school where her father had taught was still standing, though under new management. The boarding house where she had lived after his death was gone, replaced by a modern building. They walked the streets of her past, and Julia told Preston stories about her childhood, pointing out places that had been important to her. It was bittersweet, seeing the life she had left behind, but she had no regrets. "This was my past," she told Preston as they stood outside the building that had once been her father's school. "But you and the ranch and our children, that is my life, my real life. I would not change a single thing about how I got there." From Boston, they took a train to New York, then back west through Chicago and across the plains. It was Julia's first time on a train since she had traveled to Montana as a young woman fleeing her old life. The experience was different now, traveling in comfort with the man she loved, watching the country roll past the windows without fear or desperation. When they finally returned to Montana, to the ranch and their family, Julia kissed the ground dramatically, making Preston laugh. "I missed it," she said, not entirely joking. "I missed the space, the sky, the mountains. I missed home." "Home missed you too," Preston said, pulling her close. "I missed you too." Their children and grandchildren had prepared a surprise party for their return, the house decorated and filled with food and laughter. Preston and Julia stood in the middle of it all, holding hands, feeling blessed beyond measure. That night, alone finally in their bedroom, they lay together in the darkness, talking quietly about the trip and how good it was to be home. 25 years, Julia said softly. A quarter of a century. Best 25 years anyone could ask for, Preston replied. "Do you think about it still? That night you found me, sometimes, do you, all the time? I think about how close I came to dying, how easily things could have gone differently. If I had gone to a different barn, if you had not checked on the horses that night, if I had frozen just an hour earlier, so many small things that could have changed everything." Preston pulled her closer. "But they did not. You found my barn, I checked on the horses. You survived. We found each other. That is what matters." "I love you," Julia said, the words as fresh and true as they had been 25 years ago. "I will love you until I take my last breath." "And I will love you beyond that," Preston said, "into whatever comes next." They fell asleep holding each other, content and complete. The years moved on relentlessly. Preston turned 60, then 65. He was slower now, his joints stiff in the mornings, his hair completely white. But his mind was sharp, and his love for Julia burned as bright as ever. They spent more time on the porch, less time working, watching their grandchildren grow and their children take over more of the ranch operations. Julia developed arthritis in her hands, making it difficult to sew or write for long periods. But she remained active in the community, mentoring young teachers and organizing charity drives for families in need. She wore her silver locket every day, the photograph inside updated periodically to include their expanding family. On their 30th anniversary, they decided to have a quiet celebration, just the two of them. Their children offered to throw a big party, but Preston and Julia declined. They wanted simplicity, intimacy, a chance to reflect on the 3 decades they had shared. They rode out to a high meadow on the ranch, a place they had discovered early in their marriage and visited often over the years. It was spring, and the meadow was carpeted with wildflowers, purple and yellow and white. They spread a blanket and sat together, looking out over the land that had been their home for so long. 30 years, Preston said, shaking his head in wonder. It went by so fast. Not fast enough, Julia said, and when he looked at her in surprise, she smiled. I mean, I wish we had started sooner. That I had found your barn when I was 18 instead of 22, then we would have had even more years together. Preston laughed, the sound rich and warm. We have had plenty of years, and God willing, we will have plenty more. They did have more years, though not as many as they hoped. Preston developed a cough the following winter that turned into pneumonia. He fought it stubbornly, refusing to stay in bed, insisting he had too much work to do. But eventually, his body betrayed him. Julia nursed him through the worst of it, sitting by his bedside day and night, reading to him, talking to him, holding his hand. Their children came, their grandchildren, all of them worried and praying. And slowly, Preston began to improve. The fever broke, the cough eased, and he began to regain his strength. You are not getting rid of me that easily, he told Julia when he was finally able to sit up and take solid food again. Good, she said, trying to hide the tears of relief, because I am not done with you yet. He recovered fully, though the illness aged him. He walked with a cane now and tired more easily, but he was alive, and that was all that mattered to Julia. They adjusted their routines, taking things slower, resting more, but still finding joy in each day. Their 35th anniversary came and went, celebrated with a family dinner at the ranch. All their children and grandchildren were there. 3 generations gathered around the extended table Preston had built himself years ago. As Preston looked around at the faces of his family, he felt a profound sense of gratitude and accomplishment. This was his legacy, these people who existed because he had checked his barn one frozen December night. More years passed. Preston turned 70, and Julia was 63. They were old now by any measure, but they were still together, still finding reasons to smile every day. They spent most of their time on the porch, watching the ranch continue under Thomas's capable leadership, playing with their great-grandchildren, sharing stories with each other that they had told 100 times before, but never tired of hearing. On their 40th anniversary, the whole town of Kelton honored them with a celebration in the town square. The mayor gave a speech about how Preston and Julia represented the best of Montana. Hardworking, honest, devoted to family and community. A photographer took their picture, which was later published in the territorial newspaper with an article about their remarkable love story. 40 years ago, I found you in my barn, Preston said to Julia that night as they prepared for bed. 40 years ago, you saved my life, Julia replied. We saved each other, Preston said, the same thing he always said. And it was true. They had saved each other in every way that mattered. They lived quietly for the next few years, their world shrinking to the ranch and each other and the steady stream of visitors who came to see them. Catherine came often with her youngest daughter. Thomas stopped by every day. The twins, now married with families of their own, made sure their parents wanted for nothing. Julia's health began to decline when she was 68. She developed a weakness in her legs that made walking difficult, then impossible. Preston refused to let her feel diminished by this. He carried her to the porch every morning, brought her meals, read to her in the evenings. He cared for her with the same tenderness he had shown that first night, 45 years earlier. You do not have to do all this, Julia told him one day as he helped her dress. We can hire someone to help. I want to do it, Preston said firmly. You took care of me when I had pneumonia. Now it is my turn. Besides, I like taking care of you. It makes me feel useful. Julia reached up to touch his face, her fingers trembling slightly. You have always been useful. You have been everything to me. They celebrated their 45th anniversary in the bedroom, Julia too weak to make it to the porch. Preston sat beside her bed, holding her hand, telling her for the 1,000th time the story of how he had found her. I thought you were an angel, he said, smiling at the memory. Lying there in the hay, you looked otherworldly. I could not believe you were real. I was not much of an angel, Julia said, her voice weak but amused. I was a mess. You were perfect. You have always been perfect to me. Julia squeezed his hand weakly. 45 years. We have had such a good life, Preston. The best life, he agreed. She died 3 weeks later, peacefully in her sleep, with Preston holding her hand. She was 69 years old. Preston was 76, and in that moment he felt every single one of those years crushing down on him. The funeral was well attended, the church packed with family and friends and community members whose lives Julia had touched over the decades. Preston sat in the front row, his children around him, his grandchildren behind, listening to the eulogies that painted a picture of a remarkable woman. Teacher, mother, wife, friend, pillar of the community. All true, all accurate, but none of it captured the essence of who Julia had been to him. She had been his salvation, his partner, his love, the woman who had made everything in his life worthwhile, and now she was gone. After the burial, after the reception, after the last sympathetic visitor had left, Preston went home to the ranch. He sent everyone away, insisting he needed to be alone. Then he walked slowly through the empty house, touching things that had been hers, remembering. He ended up in their bedroom, holding the silver locket he had given her on their wedding day. Inside was the latest photograph, taken just a few months ago. Preston and Julia surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, 4 generations of the family they had created together. Preston sat on the bed and cried then, deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere in his soul. He cried for Julia, for himself, for all the years they would not have together. He cried until he had no tears left, and then he just sat in the silence, holding the locket, feeling more alone than he had since he was 19 years old and newly orphaned. The weeks that followed were dark. Preston went through the motions of living, but there was no joy in it. He ate because his children insisted. He got out of bed because staying there seemed like giving up. But he felt like a ghost in his own life, going through familiar routines that had lost all meaning. Thomas found him one evening sitting on the porch, staring out at nothing. "Dad," Thomas said gently, "I am worried about you." "I am fine," Preston said automatically. "No, you are not. You have barely eaten in days. You are not sleeping. You barely speak to anyone." Preston looked at his son, this good man he and Julia had raised together. "I do not know how to do this without her," he admitted. "Every single thing I do, I used to do with her or for her. Now what is the point?" Thomas sat down beside his father. "The point is that she would want you to keep living. She would not want you to give up. I know that. But knowing it and feeling it are 2 different things." They sat in silence for a while, then Thomas said, "Tell me again how you met her." So Preston did. He told the story he had told so many times, but this time it was different. This time it was not a celebration but a memorial. He told Thomas about finding Julia in the barn, about the 3 days that changed his life, about asking her to marry him and her saying yes. He told the whole story, tears streaming down his face, and when he finished, he felt something inside him ease slightly. "That is a love story for the ages," Thomas said quietly. "You two had something special, something rare, and you got 45 years of it. That is more than most people get in a lifetime. I wanted more, Preston said. I wanted 50 years, 60 forever. I know. But you got what you got, and it was beautiful. Do not dishonor that by giving up now. Preston looked at his son with new appreciation. When did you get so wise? I had good parents, Thomas said simply. Slowly, painfully, Preston began to heal. He would never stop missing Julia, never stop feeling the empty space where she used to be. But he learned to live with the loss, to find meaning in his days again. He spent more time with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandmother. He worked with Thomas on ranch business, offering the wisdom of his years. He even returned to church, finding some comfort in the familiar rituals and hymns. 1 year after Julia's death, Preston went back to the meadow where they had celebrated their 30th anniversary. It was spring again, and the wildflowers were blooming just as they had been that day. He sat on the grass, his old bones protesting, and talked to Julia as though she were sitting beside him. I miss you every day, he told her, but I am still here, still living the life we built together. Our children are good people, Julia. We did well with them, and they have given us such a legacy. 15 grandchildren now and 8 great-grandchildren. Can you believe that? All of them because I checked the barn that night. He liked to think she could hear him, that somewhere she was listening and smiling. Preston lived for 3 more years after Julia's death, dying peacefully at the age of 79. He was on the porch, his favorite place, watching a summer sunset when his heart simply stopped. Thomas found him there, still sitting in his chair, a slight smile on his face. At Preston's funeral, Thomas stood up to deliver the eulogy. He talked about his father's strength, his integrity, his devotion to family. But most of all, he talked about Preston's love for Julia. My father loved my mother more than he loved anything in this world, Thomas said, his voice strong despite his grief. He loved her from the moment he found her in his barn until the moment he took his last breath. And I believe that if love can transcend death, then they are together now, reunited in whatever comes after this life. My father always said that finding my mother was the best thing that ever happened to him. And watching them together all these years, watching how they loved and supported and cherished each other, was the best thing that ever happened to me. They showed me what a marriage should be, what love can be when 2 people truly commit to each other. That is their legacy, and it will live on in all of us. Preston was buried next to Julia in the cemetery outside Kelton, their headstones simple and side by side. Beloved husband and father, Preston's Reed. Beloved wife and mother, Reed Julia's. But everyone who had known them understood that these simple words could not begin to capture the depth of what they had shared. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through the generations. Thomas ran it until he was too old, then his son took over, then his grandson. The house was expanded and modernized over the years, but the bedroom where Preston and Julia had slept for 45 years was kept largely unchanged, a shrine to the love story that had started it all. On cold December nights, when the wind howled across the Montana plains and snow piled deep against the barn doors, the family would gather in that room and tell the story. The story of how Preston Bowman had found a woman freezing in his barn, and 3 days later she was wearing his ring. The story of how a chance encounter in the darkness had blossomed into a love that spanned decades and created a family and became the stuff of legend. And in the telling and retelling, Preston and Julia lived on, their love immortalized, their legacy secure. They had started with nothing but each other and built something that would endure long after they were gone. A family, a home, a love story for the ages. In the end, that was everything.